Welcome to the third and final part of our series documenting every execution during Joe Biden's presidency. In these 26 stories, we enter the most recent and, in some cases, most debated cases from late 2023 through scheduled executions in 2024. These are the final chapters in the lives of people whose crimes and last moments sparked outrage, sorrow, and sometimes forgiveness. Some cases reveal legal firsts or new methods, while others echo decades-old injustices. Listen closely and decide for yourself. Are these stories of justice or warnings of a justice system still searching for answers? Let's begin. Philip D. Hancock. Philip D. Hancock's execution ended a legal saga spanning over 2 decades. In 2001, a confrontation over a drug dispute turned deadly when Hancock shot and killed 2 men inside an Oklahoma City home. Hancock always claimed he acted in self-defense, but the jury sided with the prosecution's narrative of calculated violence. Over the years, his defense cited inadequate representation and alleged suppression of evidence, but appeals courts let the conviction stand. As his execution neared, advocates called attention to new evidence and doubts about his guilt, but the governor denied clemency. Hancock's final meal was classic: steak, a baked potato, and a slice of cheesecake, comforts from a life left behind. Facing the witnesses in the chamber, Hancock offered an apology to the victims' families, saying he wished things had never happened. At 59, he was executed by lethal injection, leaving behind family members still searching for answers and activists still raising questions about fairness and finality. Kenneth Eugene Smith. Kenneth Eugene Smith's case made international headlines as Alabama's first execution using nitrogen gas, a new, untested method. Smith had been on death row for more than 30 years for his role in the 1988 murder-for-hire killing of Elizabeth Sennett, a pastor's wife. He was paid to carry out the brutal crime, which left a community devastated and a family grieving for decades. His legal journey was long, with 2 trials and years of appeals. As execution day approached, activists, faith leaders, and even Senate sons debated whether the punishment fit the crime. For his last meal, Smith chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, Southern staples. In his final words, he apologized to the victim's family, asking for forgiveness, and said he hoped the ordeal would finally bring them peace. At 58, Smith's execution marked a grim milestone for Alabama and reignited fierce debates about the future of execution methods in America. Ivan Abner Cantu. Ivan Abner Cantu's conviction came after the 2000 double murder of his cousin and his cousin's fiancée in Dallas. Prosecutors argued Cantu's motive was greed, killing to steal drugs, cash, and valuables. From the start, Cantu claimed he was framed, and as his execution approached, innocence advocates pointed to new witness affidavits and concerns about the investigation. Multiple podcasts and news articles took up his case, calling for a halt to the execution so new evidence could be reviewed. Texas officials denied the requests, insisting justice had been served. For his last meal, Cantu requested a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake, comfort food reminiscent of ordinary life. Facing the witnesses, he used his final words to maintain his innocence, urging others to keep fighting for those wrongly accused. At 50, Cantu was executed by lethal injection, his story fueling ongoing national debates about wrongful convictions and the reliability of evidence in capital cases. Willie James Pye. The murder of Stephanie Sturgis in 1993 led to the conviction and eventual execution of Willie James Pye. Pye was a troubled man with a long history of childhood abuse, mental health issues, and intellectual disability. His trial and appeals were marred by questions of fairness, ineffective counsel, and whether he truly understood the consequences of his actions. Despite the jury's decision, his supporters pleaded for clemency, pointing to mitigating factors and his expressions of remorse. For his last meal, Pye chose fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea, a meal he'd often had in better times. In his final words, he addressed the victim's family, apologizing for their loss and asking for forgiveness. At 59, Willie James Pye was executed by lethal injection in Georgia, closing a case that continues to spark debate about mental health and mercy within the justice system. Michael DeWayne Smith. Michael DeWayne Smith's crimes shook Oklahoma City in 2002, when he killed two people, a black woman and an Asian man, in what prosecutors described as a senseless, racially charged shooting spree. Smith had a history of addiction, trauma, and childhood abuse, which his defense argued fueled his violent behavior. The trial was contentious, with Smith's mental health, substance use, and remorse all examined in detail. After years on death row, his appeals were exhausted. For his last meal, Smith asked for cheeseburgers, onion rings, and a Coke, reminders of simpler days. Facing execution, he apologized to the victims' families, expressing regret for all the pain he'd caused and saying he hoped they could find some measure of peace. At 41, Smith's execution marked the end of a painful chapter, one that left a community mourning and asking how many tragedies could have been prevented with more support and intervention. Brian Joseph Dorsey. Brian Joseph Dorsey's life spiraled out of control in 2006 when he killed his cousin and her husband in their home, an act he attributed to a drug-induced psychosis. The brutal double murder left a family shattered and Dorsey racked with remorse. Over the years, Dorsey became a model prisoner, mentoring others and receiving praise from prison staff for his compassion and kindness. Supporters, including corrections officers, pleaded for clemency, highlighting his rehabilitation and transformation while incarcerated. His last meal was a comforting plate of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, a taste of home before the end. In his final words, Dorsey expressed deep sorrow to the victim's family, asking for forgiveness and wishing them healing. At 52, he was executed by lethal injection, leaving behind a legacy of regret and a lingering debate about redemption, forgiveness, and what justice should look like for the truly repentant. Jamie Ray Mills. The case of Jamie Ray Mills began with a brutal robbery in 2004 when Mills and an accomplice broke into the home of Floyd and Vera Hill, murdering the elderly couple for money and valuables. The killings were particularly violent, and Mills's trial focused on his lengthy criminal history and the trauma left behind. Despite his expressions of remorse, jurors were unmoved. After nearly 2 decades on death row, Mills's appeals were exhausted and the execution date set. For his last meal, Mills requested barbecue ribs, baked beans, and cornbread, a taste of the South and memories of family cookouts. He declined to make a final statement, maintaining silence as the lethal injection was administered. At 50, Jamie Ray Mills's execution brought closure for some, but for others, it was another grim reminder of how cycles of crime, addiction, and violence can tear apart families and communities. David R. Hosier. David R. Hosier's case was rooted in obsession and jealousy. In 2009, he killed Angela Gilpin and her husband after their romantic relationship ended, unable to accept the breakup. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man driven to violence by bitterness and rejection. Hosier never denied the relationship, but always insisted he did not commit the murders, spending years maintaining his innocence. Appeals, citing questionable evidence and new witnesses, ultimately failed. His last meal was a familiar favorite: pizza, salad, and ice cream. As he faced the witnesses, Hosier used his final words to again proclaim his innocence, asking for prayers for everyone involved and saying he forgave those who convicted him. At 69, he became one of Missouri's oldest executed inmates, leaving behind a legacy of heartbreak for multiple families and a stark warning about the dangers of obsession and unresolved anger. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez. In 2001, Ramiro Felix Gonzalez killed an 18-year-old woman during a burglary. The crime was senseless, fueled by drugs and desperation, and the aftermath devastated her family and the wider community. Over the years, Gonzalez became known for his efforts to give back. He even offered to donate a kidney to save someone's life, but Texas denied his request. His appeals for mercy were supported by faith leaders and human rights activists, yet they fell on deaf ears. For his last meal, Gonzalez asked for fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, one last meal reminiscent of his youth. In his final words, he apologized to the victim's family and all those he hurt, expressing hope that his death might bring them some peace. At 41, Gonzalez was executed by lethal injection, his story highlighting themes of remorse, missed opportunities, and the ongoing debate over redemption on death row. Richard Norman Rojam, Jr. The 1984 abduction and murder of Rojam's stepdaughter sent shockwaves through Oklahoma. Richard Norman Rojam, Jr. was convicted based on testimony and circumstantial evidence. But for decades he maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. Rojam's appeals ran through every level of the court system, with his supporters pointing to problems with the investigation. But the courts upheld his conviction. His last meal was classic death row fare: cheeseburgers and fries. In his final statement, Rojam apologized to his family, asked for forgiveness, and said he hoped one day the truth would come out. At 66, Rojam's execution closed one of Oklahoma's oldest capital cases, leaving a legacy of pain for those who loved the victim and unresolved questions for those who believe the state sometimes gets it wrong. Keith Edmund Gavin. Keith Edmund Gavin was sentenced to death for the 1998 robbery and murder of a delivery driver in Cherokee County, Alabama. His trial and appeals were marked by questions about the quality of his legal defense and claims of racial bias in jury selection. Gavin maintained his innocence throughout, arguing that critical evidence was ignored. The state maintained he was responsible, and the courts agreed. As execution day approached, Gavin spent his last hours in prayer. For his final meal, he chose fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread, a nod to Southern tradition. In his last words, he apologized to the victim's family, saying he wished the crime had never happened and hoped they might find peace. At 64, Gavin's execution closed another chapter in Alabama's long and contentious history with the death penalty. Arthur Lee Burton. Arthur Lee Burton's crime was the double murder of two women in Houston, a case marked by conflicting witness statements and repeated claims of innocence. For decades, Burton's legal team pressed for new DNA testing and reviews of the evidence, believing the investigation was rushed and biased. The courts, however, ruled against further stays. Burton's final meal was cheeseburgers and fries, a classic comfort food, possibly his last small pleasure in life. When facing execution, Burton offered an apology to the victims' families, stating, "I'm sorry for everything," and expressed hope that his death would bring them some measure of closure. At 54, he was executed by lethal injection, leaving his supporters wondering if every avenue for truth and justice had truly been explored before the state carried out its ultimate sentence. 13th, Tabaron, Dave Honey. Utah hadn't carried out an execution in years when Tabaron Dave Honey's date arrived. Convicted of killing his ex-girlfriend's mother in 1998, Honey's case was notable for its brutality and the emotional testimony of surviving relatives. Throughout his years on death row, Honey's attorneys argued about his troubled childhood and mental health struggles, while prosecutors focused on the terror and loss suffered by the family. For his last meal, Honey asked for steak, potatoes, and green beans, a meal reminiscent of family dinners. In his last words, he apologized to the family and said he hoped for peace for everyone involved, including his own loved ones. At 48, Honey's execution marked a rare use of capital punishment in Utah and reignited debate about whether the state should still carry out executions at all. Loran Kensley Cole. Loran Kensley Cole was sentenced to death for a robbery and murder that took place in Marion County, Florida, in 1994. Over the years, his case cycled through numerous appeals, focusing on questions of ineffective counsel and mental health. Despite these efforts, the courts denied clemency, and the execution moved forward. For his last meal, Cole selected fried chicken, coleslaw, and sweet tea, reminders of a world outside prison walls. As he faced execution, Cole declined to make a final statement, opting for silence in his last moments. At 57, his death marked the end of a decades-long legal process that left many wondering whether enough was done to examine every detail and protect the rights of the condemned. Freddie Eugene Owens. The 1997 murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery put Freddie Eugene Owens on South Carolina's death row. Owens, young and addicted at the time, showed remorse throughout his years in prison, participating in programs and expressing sorrow for his crime. Supporters highlighted his transformation, but prosecutors and the victim's family emphasized the pain and loss he caused. For his last meal, Owens chose cheeseburgers and fries, a nod to his youth. In his final statement, he apologized, saying he hoped for forgiveness and understanding. At 46, Owens was executed by lethal injection, leaving behind a debate about the possibility of change and redemption, even for those convicted of the worst crimes. Marcellus E. Williams. Marcellus E. Williams was convicted in 2001 for the stabbing death of Felicia Gale, a St. Louis reporter. The case gained national attention due to post-conviction DNA testing that suggested someone else may have been involved. Williams's execution was delayed multiple times as courts reviewed the new evidence, but in 2024, the state moved forward. For his last meal, Williams requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. In his last words, he proclaimed his innocence, asking the public to keep fighting for justice and calling on the governor to reconsider future executions where doubt remains. At 55, Williams' case underscored the risks of wrongful convictions and the high stakes of the death penalty. Travis Mullis. Travis Mullis's crime stands out as one of the most shocking in Texas history. In 2008, Mullis killed his 2-month-old son in a fit of rage, later confessing to the crime and leading police to the child's body. His case horrified even seasoned prosecutors, with many struggling to understand how someone could commit such an act. Mullis's defense pointed to severe mental health problems and a traumatic upbringing. For his last meal, he chose pizza, fries, and ice cream, foods reminiscent of happier childhood times. Facing the execution chamber, Mullis apologized to his family, expressing sorrow for the pain he caused and asking for forgiveness. At 38, his execution closed a case that will haunt Texas for years, reminding all of the far-reaching effects of unaddressed mental health crises and childhood trauma. Emmanuel A. Littlejohn. In 1992, Emmanuel A. Littlejohn was sentenced to death for his role in the murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery. While he admitted to participating in the crime, he always maintained that he was not the one who fired the fatal shot, arguing that his role was minor. Over the years, his legal team fought for clemency, citing the harshness of his sentence compared to others involved in the crime. For his final meal, he requested a cheeseburger, fries, and soda. In his last words, Littlejohn asked for forgiveness and peace for all the families affected. At 52, he was executed, his case raising questions about sentencing disparities, accomplice liability, and whether mercy should play a larger role in America's justice system. Allen Eugene Miller. Allen Eugene Miller's story ended in controversy and headlines. Convicted for the 1999 workplace shootings of 3 co-workers in Shelby County, Alabama, Miller spent years on death row as courts debated the fairness of his trial and whether he should be executed by lethal injection or a new method. In 2024, Alabama used nitrogen gas, a rare and untested method, to carry out the execution, making Miller only the second in the U.S. to die this way. For his last meal, Miller chose steak, potatoes, and cake, his idea of a final comfort. In his last words, he apologized for his actions, expressing remorse and hoping for forgiveness from those he hurt. At 59, Miller's execution reignited debates about execution methods and whether such innovations represent progress or cruelty in the search for a more humane death penalty. Garcia Glenn White. Garcia Glenn White was sentenced to death for the 1989 murders of 2 women and a girl in Houston, Texas. White's case was marked by years of legal twists as new evidence emerged and his legal team raised questions about his mental competency. Despite doubts, the courts ruled he was fit for execution. For his last meal, he requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy, a meal reminiscent of Sunday family dinners. In his last words, White expressed regret for his actions and asked for forgiveness from the victims' families, saying he wished he could take back what he had done. At 61, White's death closed a decades-old case, leaving behind pain and questions about the limits of justice and mercy. Derek Dearman. The 2016 rampage by Derek Dearman in Mobile County, Alabama, left 5 people dead, including a pregnant woman, and stunned the nation. Dearman claimed drug-induced psychosis drove his actions, but the brutality of the murders led to swift conviction and a death sentence. His trial was filled with emotional testimony from survivors and family members. Despite claims of remorse and appeals citing mental illness, the courts upheld the sentence. For his last meal, Dearman chose burgers, fries, and a milkshake. In his last words, he apologized to the victims' families and asked for mercy, expressing regret for what he had done. At 36, his execution brought a measure of closure to a case that left deep scars on an entire community. Richard Bernard Moore. Richard Bernard Moore was convicted of killing a convenience store clerk during a botched robbery in 1999. His appeals often focused on the state's execution methods, lethal injection, electric chair, or the newly authorized firing squad, sparking national attention and legal wrangling. Moore's last meal was fried fish, French fries, and coleslaw, familiar foods from his upbringing. In his final words, he accepted responsibility, expressed remorse for his actions, and said he hoped for forgiveness. At 59, Moore's execution closed one of South Carolina's longest-running capital cases and underscored the controversy surrounding how executions are carried out. Carrie Dale Grayson. Carrie Dale Grayson was one of 4 teens convicted in the 1994 torture and murder of a homeless man in Birmingham, Alabama, a crime marked by shocking cruelty and later immortalized in true crime documentaries. Over the years, Grayson's appeals focused on his young age at the time of the crime and his history of abuse. For his last meal, he requested chicken fingers, fries, and a milkshake, foods from his youth. In his last words, Grayson apologized to the victim's family and asked for forgiveness, expressing regret for what he'd done as a teenager. At 50, his execution highlighted the questions of juvenile justice, accountability, and whether young offenders should ever face the ultimate punishment. Christopher Leroy Collings. The rape and murder of 9-year-old Rowan Ford in 2007 brought Christopher Leroy Collings to Missouri's death row. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators and drew outrage from the community. Collings confessed, providing details that left no doubt about his guilt, yet his defense cited intellectual disability and argued against execution. His appeals failed. For his last meal, Collings chose pizza, soda, and cake, perhaps a memory of childhood before his life took a dark turn. In his last words, he apologized and said he was ready to meet his maker. At 49, Collings's execution brought closure to some, but for others, it was a painful reminder that even the harshest punishment can't heal all wounds. Joseph Edward Corcoran. Joseph Edward Corcoran's path to execution began in 1997, when he shot and killed 4 men in a drug-fueled rage in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Over decades on death row, Corcoran became a volunteer, waiving further appeals and requesting his own execution, tired of waiting. His final meal was steak, mashed potatoes, and corn, a hearty plate. In his last words, Corcoran expressed remorse, apologized to the victims' families, and told his own family he loved them. At 49, Indiana executed him, and in a case marked by violence, regret, and the controversial practice of allowing inmates to volunteer for their own deaths. Kevin Ray Underwood. Kevin Ray Underwood was convicted for the 2006 murder and attempted cannibalism of 10-year-old Jamie Rose Bolin in Purcell, Oklahoma, a crime so gruesome it sent shockwaves throughout the state. Underwood confessed in chilling detail, and his trial focused more on his mental health than guilt. For his last meal, he requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy. In his last words, Underwood apologized to the victim's family and said he hoped his death would bring them some relief. At 45, his execution ended one of Oklahoma's most infamous murder cases, a story that lingers as a warning about untreated mental illness and the darkest reaches of human behavior. These final 26 cases close our series on executions during Joe Biden's presidency. Each story is unique, marked by pain, loss, and sometimes the hope of redemption. The debate over capital punishment continues. Are these acts justice or simply the end of more suffering? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If these stories moved you, subscribe for more and let us know your thoughts in the comments. This is Final Sentence, where every story, no matter how dark, deserves to be heard.